Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allah says in the Quran, and if they incline to peace, then incline to it also, and rely upon Allah. Indeed, it is He who is the hearing, the knowing. Surah Al-Anfal 8-61. When Allah Himself tells us that if there is an opportunity for peace, we must lean towards it, we begin to realize that the pursuit of peace is not a weakness. It is a command, it is a responsibility. It is a path to higher wisdom. Sometimes we look at global politics, we see nations clashing, wars erupting, sanctions flying, threats increasing, and when the guns go silent, we are left to ask, why? Why the sudden ceasefire? What lies beneath? What's the real story? Is it truly about compassion? Is it about justice? Or is there something much deeper, hidden interests, economic calculations, political survival? My brothers, my sisters, we must understand that the events of the world are never random. They are deeply connected to power, wealth, influence, and most importantly, the plan of Allah. The world may show us one thing, but the truth is often something else. Iran, America, and Israel, three nations, different ideologies, conflicting histories, suddenly talking about ceasefires. Why? Allah reminds us in the Quran, they plan and Allah plans, and Allah is the best of planners. When we witness the events of the world unfolding before our eyes, we often see wars that shake entire nations, battles that destroy cities, and conflicts that seem endless. And then suddenly there is a ceasefire. The world headlines announce it as a victory, as a moment of relief, as though the chapter of war has finally closed. But if we ponder carefully, we begin to understand that sometimes peace is not the end of war. Sometimes peace is merely a pause, a temporary silence, a break that allows those involved to regroup, to reposition, to reconsider their strategies. And the tragedy is that while the guns have stopped firing, the hearts remain bleeding. The suffering continues in silence, behind the scenes, away from the cameras, hidden from the front pages. Sometimes the ceasefire is not the fruit of genuine compassion, but rather a calculated step taken because of international pressure, political fatigue, or financial exhaustion. And when the world tells us the war has ended, we must ask ourselves, has it truly ended, or has it just taken a new form? Has it shifted from physical confrontation to economic manipulation, from open hostility to silent oppression? The believer must develop insight, must learn to see beyond the surface. We should not be satisfied with what is fed to us on television screens or in newspaper headlines. Allah commands us to reflect, to investigate, and not to accept information blindly. When we hear news of peace, we must ask, what is the price of this peace? Who truly benefits and who continues to suffer in silence? The reality of our time is that wars are no longer confined to battlefields. The war of narratives, the war of influence, the war of economy, the war of control of these continue even when the bullets stop. Sometimes what appears to be peace is just a rearrangement of power, a reshuffling of interests, a diplomatic handshake that conceals the bitterness that still burns in the hearts of the oppressed. If we were to travel through the ruins of the cities that were bombed, if we were to visit the homes that were destroyed, if we were to sit with the families who lost their loved ones, we would realize that the ceasefire does not erase the pain. The ceasefire does not bring back the father who was killed. It does not heal the child who was orphaned. It does not rebuild the home that was shattered. The ceasefire may bring a political agreement, but the emotional wounds often remain unhealed for generations. We must also understand that sometimes wars are paused not because there is a sincere desire for peace, but because the machinery of war needs to be maintained, the supply lines need to be replenished, the allies need to be consulted, and the next phase of strategy needs to be carefully planned. If we study history, we will see countless examples of ceasefires that were only temporary pauses that led to more intense wars, truces that were broken as soon as it suited one side. And yet, many people rush to believe that the silence of the guns means the arrival of lasting peace. The believer is not naive. The believer understands that the world is full of complex agreements, secret negotiations, and shifting alliances. Sometimes, the very people who were seen as enemies yesterday are the ones sitting at the negotiating table today, signing agreements of cooperation. Allah has taught us to think, to analyze, to look beyond what is presented to us. The Quran encourages us to verify information to avoid becoming people who are easily misled. When the world tells us to celebrate peace, we must ask, is it truly peace? Has the root cause of the conflict been addressed? Has justice been restored? Or has the violence simply been silenced, waiting to erupt again in a different form? In many cases, the answer is painful. The powerful may shake hands in front of the cameras, but the oppressed continue to suffer without a voice. The ceasefire becomes a tool to preserve the interests of those in power, not necessarily to serve the rights of the weak. We must also remember that true peace cannot exist where oppression remains. True peace cannot exist where injustice is ignored. True peace cannot exist where people are silenced, where their dignity is stripped, where their lands are occupied, where their livelihoods are stolen. Sometimes the announcement of peace is simply a strategic pause that allows the powerful to reset the game. And the world watches, believing that the storm has passed, unaware that the storm has only taken a new shape. When we listen carefully, we realize that silence can sometimes be louder than bombs. The ceasefire may stop the immediate bloodshed, but it may be accompanied by economic sieges, political blockades, or cultural erasure. It is a silence that still suffocates, a silence that still kills, a silence that the world often ignores. The believer understands that not every silence is peaceful. Sometimes silence is a more painful form of oppression because the world no longer sees it as urgent. When we observe global conflicts, we notice how the narrative is carefully crafted. The stories we are told are chosen selectively. The images we see are framed intentionally. The timelines presented to us are curated to guide our emotions. This is why the believer must not stop at the surface. We must become people who think deeply, who ask the uncomfortable questions, who seek to understand what is hidden behind the carefully polished speeches. Sometimes peace is announced just in time for political gain. Leaders may need to show progress before an election. Superpowers may need to calm their own populations who are tired of war. Sometimes peace is called because the international markets are suffering, and financial stability is more valuable at that moment than continued warfare. And sometimes peace is agreed upon not because the hearts have softened, but because a more effective form of control has been discovered. The believer must be aware that the world often operates on layers. There is what we are told, and there is what truly happens. Allah has gifted us the ability to reflect, to discern, to question. When we hear news of a ceasefire, we should ask ourselves, who stands to gain? Who stands to lose? Is this peace sincere, or is it a carefully calculated truce that serves a deeper agenda? True peace must be built on justice, on honesty, on the protection of human dignity. Anything less is merely a fragile pause that may shatter at any moment. There are times when the global focus shifts from one conflict to another. The cameras leave, the reporters move on, but the pain remains. The oppressed are left to rebuild their lives in silence. They are left to live with the scars of war long after the world has declared the matter resolved. This is why the believer must continue to care even when the world stops caring. The believer must continue to pray, to advocate, to support, even when the headlines no longer mention the suffering. When we see ceasefires being declared, we should remember that behind these agreements are countless untold stories, countless broken homes, countless graves that were filled before the politicians sat down at the table. And while the world may choose to forget, Allah never forgets. Every injustice, every broken heart, every tear shed by the oppressed is known to Allah. His justice may not arrive immediately in this world, but His justice is absolute, perfect and inevitable. The believer must never become someone who simply consumes information without reflection. The believer must not become someone who only repeats what is heard without verification. Allah has made it a duty upon us to be people of wisdom, people who seek the truth, people who are not fooled by appearances. Sometimes the silence after the war is more dangerous than the noise during the war because it allows false narratives to settle. It allows the world to believe that all is well, while the seeds of the next conflict are quietly being planted. We must also recognize that sometimes the greatest victims of ceasefires are the ones who never held weapons, the ones who never sat at negotiation tables. They are the mothers who lost their children, the fathers who buried their sons, the children who now carry the memories of explosions instead of toys. They are the ones who live with the daily struggle of rebuilding what was destroyed. Their voices are often silenced. Their stories are often buried beneath political agreements. It is not enough for the believer to accept peace by name. We must seek peace by its reality. Is it truly peace if the oppressor remains in power? Is it truly peace if the victims are not heard? Is it truly peace if the structures of injustice continue to function? These are the questions we must ask. These are the reflections that should guide our understanding of global events. When the Quran speaks about peace, it does not refer to superficial peace. It refers to real peace, a peace that is rooted in justice, a peace that brings healing, a peace that restores rights, a peace that upholds truth. Anything less is simply a temporary arrangement that may collapse with the slightest pressure. The believer understands that the world is filled with complex plots, but no plot can overcome the plan of Allah. Those who build their power on oppression will one day face the collapse of their empires. Those who chase political victories at the expense of human dignity will one day answer for every soul they harm. The believer knows that the final judgment belongs to Allah and His justice is complete. Sometimes the world moves so fast that we forget the lessons of the past. We see wars starting and ending, conflicts erupting and calming, but we rarely stop to ask why. Why did it start? Why did it stop? Who controlled the narrative? Who benefited? Who was silenced? If we look carefully, we realize that many conflicts are prolonged or paused based on the calculations of those in power, not necessarily based on the pursuit of truth. The believer must be careful not to become a passive observer of global events. We must remain engaged, informed, and spiritually aware. We must remember that the suffering of others is not distant from us simply because it happens across borders. Every tear matters, every life matters, and every false peace must be questioned. Sometimes we are told that the war is over, but in reality, it has only moved to another form. The tools of warfare may change, but the oppression continues. The ceasefire may stop the bombs, but it may introduce economic chains, political restrictions, or cultural erasure. This is why the believer must continue to pray for true peace, not just for silence. We must pray for justice, not just for treaties. We must pray for healing, not just for headlines. When we see ceasefires, we must remember the lessons of history. How many ceasefires were broken? How many truces were temporary? How many times did the world believe that peace had arrived, only for the flames of conflict to reignite? True peace is not a photo opportunity. True peace is not a diplomatic handshake. True peace is the result of removing injustice, of restoring dignity, of upholding the rights of all people. The believer is taught to never stop seeking the truth. Even when the world says the matter is closed, we continue to reflect, to investigate, to stand with the oppressed, to pray for those who are forgotten. We remember that silence can be louder than bombs, and sometimes the greatest battles are those that are fought in the hearts of the people who refuse to give up on justice, who refuse to forget the pain of the oppressed, who refuse to accept false narratives. Allah reminds us in the Quran, "Call upon me, I will respond to you." When we truly reflect upon these words, we realize the power that lies in our connection with our Creator. Sometimes when we see the world filled with political strategies, military interventions, endless negotiations, and global alliances, we begin to feel as though the power to change circumstances belongs only to those who hold positions of leadership, to those who sign agreements, to those who possess weapons and control wealth. But in reality, the believer knows that power belongs to Allah alone, and the sincere prayer of the oppressed can reach where no political influence can go. The sincere prayer can break what no army can break. It can change what no superpower can change. It can open doors that the world has locked tightly. It can shift hearts that leaders could not persuade. It can soften those who seemed hardened forever. This is the true power that the believer holds, and yet so many neglect it. They place their trust entirely in the machinery of this world, forgetting that the one who controls every outcome listens to the call of the brokenhearted in the depth of the night. When we look at the condition of the world, we see countless examples of oppression, injustice, and hardship. We see wars where civilians suffer the most. We see conflicts where the weak are trampled. We see struggles where the innocent carry the heaviest burdens. And the question arises, who will bring relief? The world looks towards negotiations, ceasefires, international summits, but the believer looks towards the sky. The believer knows that while the world is busy calculating strategies, the call of the oppressed rises directly to the most merciful, bypassing every barrier, surpassing every guard, reaching the highest heavens. The prayer of the sincere can reverse what seems impossible, and this is why it is one of the most powerful weapons given to the believer. The tongue that humbly whispers to Allah in the quiet of the night has more strength than the speeches of presidents and the agreements of kings. Throughout history, there were moments when the odds seemed impossible, when entire nations were against the oppressed, when the forces of injustice appeared to have complete control. And yet, with sincere prayer and steadfast patience, the oppressed were granted victory in ways they could never have imagined. The believer understands that what the world sees as weakness is in fact the greatest source of power. Raising your hands to Allah is not a sign of helplessness, it is a sign of complete reliance upon the one who never abandons. The world may mock the believer for placing so much trust in prayer, but those who know the sweetness of that connection know that prayer can change what no diplomatic channel can change. There are times when people become so consumed by global politics that they forget the power of their own du'as. They feel as though they are too insignificant to influence the world. They feel as though they are distant observers with no ability to bring about change. But the reality is that sincere prayer, made from the depth of a believing heart, travels beyond borders, beyond palaces, beyond conference rooms. The one who controls the hearts of rulers listens to the call of the servant who cries to him in sincere hope. Sometimes, when political negotiations reach a deadlock, when strategies collapse, when leaders fail, Allah opens a door because of the prayer of a mother, the prayer of an orphan, the prayer of a heart that has been broken for too long. The believer never underestimates the weight of a sincere dua. It can overturn governments, it can redirect armies, it can dismantle the most carefully crafted plans of oppression. And while wars are fought on battlefields, the ultimate victory is not written by generals. The ultimate victory is written in the decree of Allah. The outcome of every battle, the result of every negotiation, the direction of every event is controlled by the one who hears the silent cries of his servants. Sometimes the battle appears to be between tanks and soldiers, but the reality is that the real battle is being won in the unseen world through patience, through steadfastness, through reliance upon Allah. This is why we must never believe that we are powerless. The one who holds firmly to prayer holds firmly to the rope that can never be broken. When we examine history, we see that great empires rose and fell. Mighty armies were defeated by smaller forces. Superpowers were humbled by events they could not control. And behind these moments, there were often people whose names the world never recorded. People who simply prayed with sincerity. People whose tears watered the seeds of change. People whose connection with Allah was stronger than the might of nations. Sometimes the battle is not about numbers, not about weapons, not about resources. Sometimes the battle is about faith, about endurance, about who will remain firm upon truth regardless of the pressure. The believer knows that the victory of truth may take time, but it is always certain. When the believer stands in prayer, when the believer turns to Allah, when the believer places complete trust in Him, that believer is engaging in the most powerful act of resistance against injustice. No amount of media manipulation, no amount of political alliances, no amount of military power can override the decree of Allah. And it is through prayer that we align ourselves with that decree. Through prayer that we become part of the unseen changes that shape the world. Sometimes the world may see the battle unfolding in one direction, but because of the prayer of the oppressed, because of the prayer of the patient, because of the prayer of those who trust in Allah, the entire course of events can be redirected. Wars may be fought on battlefields, but they are won in the hearts. The true strength of a people is not in their weapons, but in their steadfastness, in their faith, in their refusal to surrender their hope. When people remain connected to their Creator, when they continue to raise their hands in prayer, even when the situation seems impossible, they carry within themselves a power that cannot be measured. The believer does not rely on appearances. The believer does not place hope in worldly strategies alone. The believer understands that the heart is the true battlefield. If the heart is firm, the external world cannot break it. And if the heart is weak, no amount of worldly strength can sustain it. The real victory is the ability to keep the heart alive with faith, to keep the soul connected to its Lord, to keep the tongue moist with remembrance, to keep the tears flowing in the secret hours of the night. When the world believes that power lies in armies and politics, the believer understands that power lies in patience, in prayer, in perseverance. The battle within the heart is the greatest battle, and the one who wins that battle will not be defeated even if the world turns against them. Throughout the ages, the most powerful movements were not always the ones that had the largest resources. They were often the ones whose hearts were most connected to their Creator. They were the ones who placed their trust fully in Allah. They were the ones who understood that prayer is not a last resort, but the first and most powerful action. They were the ones who did not give up when the situation looked hopeless. They were the ones who continued to pray when the world told them to surrender. They were the ones who believed that Allah could open doors where no one else could see a path. The believer understands that sometimes the most meaningful victories are not seen by the world. Sometimes the greatest success is to maintain faith in the face of oppression, to hold on to truth when falsehood surrounds you, to continue making dua when all others have fallen silent. The victory in the heart is greater than any temporary success on the battlefield, and it is this victory that leads to lasting success in this life and the next. When the believer raises his or her hands in prayer, when the believer sheds tears in sincere supplication, when the believer turns fully to Allah with absolute reliance, that believer participates in a movement far greater than any army. That believer becomes part of a silent force that shapes the world in ways that can never be fully understood. The believer knows that prayers do not vanish. Every dua is heard. Every tear is counted. Every sincere plea is answered in the perfect way, at the perfect time. And while the world may judge success based on visible results, the believer understands that success begins in the unseen. The heart that remains firm upon the truth is victorious, even if the world does not recognize it. The one who continues to make dua, who continues to trust, who continues to believe, even when the situation looks impossible, that person holds a power greater than any political alliance. The believer does not need the approval of the world. The believer seeks the approval of Allah, and that is sufficient. Wars may be fought on battlefields, but the hearts of the believers are the real fortresses. When those hearts are filled with reliance on Allah, no weapon can defeat them. When those hearts are alive with remembrance, no scheme can destroy them. When those hearts are steadfast in prayer, no plot can overcome them. The true victory is not in numbers, not in wealth, not in status. The true victory is in remaining connected to Allah, in trusting His plan, in continuing to seek His help with sincerity and humility. When the believer faces oppression, when the believer faces injustice, when the believer faces hardship, the first response is to turn to Allah. Not as a formality, not as a ritual, but as a deep and sincere act of connection. The believer places hope in the one who never disappoints. The believer understands that the prayer of the oppressed is never rejected. The believer trusts that the one who controls the entire universe is fully aware of every detail, of every tear, of every silent cry. The believer does not lose hope even when the world seems dark. The believer understands that sometimes the greatest changes begin in the unseen, through prayer, through patience, through perseverance. The believer knows that while others may measure power by external strength, true power belongs to the one who can change hearts, who can shift destinies, who can bring about victory in ways that no one could have imagined. The believer understands that the real battle is not always visible. The real battle is the battle within the heart, the battle to remain firm, the battle to continue trusting, the battle to keep making dua even when the world says it is useless. The believer knows that every sincere prayer contributes to the unfolding of events, that every plea for justice rises to the heavens, that every call for help is heard by the one whose response is always perfect. When we carefully reflect on this verse, we begin to understand that this world is a place of shifting loyalties, moving alliances, changing agreements, and political games that often surprise those who are not paying attention. Yesterday's enemies may become today's partners, and today's allies may become tomorrow's rivals. The world is in constant motion, and if we are not people of insight and reflection, we will be easily misled by appearances and labels. What we must understand is that the people who we see fighting on the surface may be sitting together in secret meetings behind closed doors. Those who appear to oppose each other in public may in fact be working towards mutual interests in private. This is why the believer must never rush to conclusions based on what is apparent. The believer is taught to think carefully, to investigate, to understand that the realities of this world are often deeper than what is shown. In history, we have seen many examples where nations that once stood on opposite sides of the battlefield became trading partners, became diplomatic allies, became voices of cooperation. Sometimes the fight is not because of principle. It is because of position, because of power, because of who will control the resources, who will shape the future direction. And when those calculations change, the alliances change. Sometimes an enemy is used as a tool for a period, and when the benefit is achieved, that same enemy is embraced as a friend. This is the world of politics, a world driven by interests, by convenience, by strategy, not always by truth or sincerity. The believer is not shocked when this happens because the believer has been taught that this world is temporary, that people's words and actions may shift with their circumstances. When we see nations moving from conflict to cooperation, we must ask, what changed? Was it truly a change of heart? Was it truly the discovery of truth? Or was it simply that the political and financial benefits of partnership became stronger than the perceived benefits of fighting? Many times, the one who is called the enemy is given that label because it is convenient at that moment. And when the convenience shifts, that label is quietly removed and the enemy becomes a friend overnight. The believer knows that such things do not surprise the one who looks with the eyes of wisdom. Allah has told us to verify, to think, to see beyond the surface. Sometimes the wars we see are not as they appear, and the alliances we see are not as they seem. When two parties fight, sometimes they fight in public but agree in private. Sometimes the conflict is a show, a display for the people, while behind the scenes, the agreements are being signed, the deals are being made, the plans are being shaped. The believer must not be naive. We must understand that the labels placed upon people and nations are often tools to guide public opinion. We are told who the enemy is, we are told who the hero is, but the truth may be much more complicated than what we are led to believe. The believer does not simply accept headlines as truth. The believer asks, who benefits from this? Who is shaping this narrative? Who is directing the flow of information? Who is deciding which voice is amplified and which voice is silenced? When alliances shift, people may be confused, but the one who is grounded in knowledge is not shaken. The believer understands that the world changes according to benefit and loss, profit and power, control and survival. What is considered wrong today may be celebrated tomorrow if it serves the right interests. What is considered an ally today may be discarded tomorrow if the calculations change. Sometimes the most powerful relationships are those that are not spoken about, those that happen in quiet rooms, those that are hidden from the public eye. The believer knows that in this world positions shift, faces change, but the underlying game remains the same. When enemies become partners, we must ask, what is driving this new friendship? Is it principle or is it profit? Is it truth or is it power? Is it sincerity or is it convenience? Many times it is convenience. When it is beneficial to fight, they fight. When it is beneficial to cooperate, they cooperate. The believer should not feel betrayed or shocked when this happens. This is the nature of the worldly game. The believer places trust in Allah, not in the words of people, not in the promises of politicians, not in the displays of public diplomacy. The believer remains firm upon the truth, regardless of who is sitting with whom, regardless of who is shaking hands with whom. When people see enemies sitting together and signing agreements, they may believe that the past is forgotten, that the battles were meaningless, that the sacrifices were in vain. But the believer understands that Allah is fully aware of every injustice, of every drop of blood, of every broken promise. People may move on quickly, but the record with Allah is precise. Sometimes the alliances of today are simply steps towards the conflicts of tomorrow. What seems like peace may only be a temporary arrangement to prepare for the next phase of power struggles. The believer is not swayed by temporary silences, by temporary handshakes, by temporary agreements. When peace is delayed, it is not a punishment from Allah. It is a test of our trust. It is a lesson for our hearts. Sometimes the path to peace is slow because Allah wants us to learn patience, to develop resilience, to increase our reliance upon Him. When peace does not come immediately, it teaches us to turn to Allah more sincerely, to call upon Him with deeper urgency, to understand that peace is not in the hands of people, but in the hands of the one who controls hearts and circumstances. When peace seems far, it is an opportunity to strengthen our connection with Allah. It is a chance to build our patience, to test our sincerity, to prove our commitment to the truth, even when the world appears to move against us. Sometimes peace is delayed because the time is not yet right. Sometimes the delay is for our own growth, for our own preparation, for our own purification. The believer understands that delay does not mean denial. The believer knows that Allah's timing is perfect, even when we cannot see the wisdom immediately. When the believer does not see peace, the believer increases in dua, increases in reliance, increases in submission. When peace is delayed, the believer's heart does not fill with despair, but rather fills with hope, knowing that Allah's plan is unfolding in the best way. When people rush towards peace through unjust means, when they accept agreements that compromise truth, when they surrender principles for quick solutions, they may achieve a temporary calm, but they will not achieve true peace. True peace is built upon justice. True peace is built upon honesty. True peace is built upon recognizing the rights of others, protecting the dignity of the oppressed, restoring what has been taken. Without these foundations, peace is just a fragile arrangement waiting to collapse. The believer does not chase peace at any cost. The believer seeks peace that is rooted in righteousness. Sometimes the wait is long because the foundations of true peace are still being prepared. Sometimes the delay is necessary so that the people involved may develop the wisdom, the maturity, the sincerity to uphold that peace. Sometimes the delay is a mercy from Allah because immediate peace without justice would simply cover the wounds without healing them. When we look at delayed peace, we must remember that Allah is in full control. We must remind ourselves that every delay carries wisdom, that every test is an opportunity to draw closer to Allah. When peace is delayed, the believer does not become bitter. The believer does not lose focus. The believer increases in good deeds, increases in reliance, increases in prayer. The believer trusts that peace will come at the time and in the way that is most beneficial, even if the world seems to be working against it. When the believer witnesses the alliances of the world shifting, when the believer sees enemies becoming friends, when the believer observes the delay in achieving peace, the believer's heart remains firm. The believer knows that Allah is guiding every event, that no deal can succeed unless Allah allows it, that no agreement can harm us unless Allah has decreed it to be a test. The believer's trust is not in human arrangements. The believer's trust is in the one who controls the entire universe. The believer understands that peace is not always delayed because of external reasons. Sometimes peace is delayed because the hearts of the people are not yet ready. Sometimes the community needs to return to Allah more sincerely. Sometimes the delay is an invitation to increase our repentance, to purify our hearts, to return to the teachings that we may have neglected. The believer understands that the journey towards peace is also a journey towards spiritual growth. When peace is delayed, the believer finds comfort in knowing that Allah's timing is precise. Nothing is early, nothing is late. Everything happens at the perfect moment. Sometimes the delay is to protect us from a greater harm that we do not yet see. Sometimes the delay is to prepare the hearts of those who will carry the responsibility of peace. Sometimes the delay is to awaken us from our distractions, to remind us of what truly matters. The believer understands that temporary setbacks are part of the journey. The believer does not allow impatience to lead to compromises that harm the long-term benefit. The believer does not rush to accept peace that is built on oppression, that ignores justice, that disregards the rights of the weak. The believer understands that true peace is worth waiting for, worth striving for, worth praying for. When we see the world shifting, when we see enemies becoming friends, when we see peace delayed, we must remember that our role is to remain firm upon truth, to continue making sincere dua, to continue trusting in Allah's wisdom. The believer's strength comes from knowing that every delay carries hidden mercy, that every shifting alliance is under Allah's control, that every event is part of a greater plan that is unfolding in the best way. The believer is not shaken by the changing faces of politics. The believer's foundation is unshakable because it is built upon trust in Allah, upon patience, upon the understanding that ultimate success belongs to those who remain firm, to those who do not compromise, to those who continue to pray with sincerity even when the path seems long. Let us remember that while the nations plan, while the powerful calculate, Allah is the best of planners. No strategy is greater than His. No deal is more binding than His decree. So the next time we hear about a ceasefire, don't just ask what has ended, ask what has begun. Has this brought true peace, or has this simply opened the door to the next phase of control? May Allah grant us wisdom. May He protect the oppressed. May He bring genuine peace to this world and eternal peace in the hereafter. Ameen.